thank you very much for the organizers for this event, for the Turkish Academy of Management and the Organization and Management Theory interest group for putting this series on and having the two leading figures in CMS together to be with us. So before I start, I will try to be brief, but I think it's not going to be brief, so I will try to read first, if Mats allow, Andres' biography, CV, and then Mats, and then we will start with the questions, okay? So, André Spicer is the Executive Dean of Bias Business School and Professor of Organizational Behavior at City St. George's, University of London. He is recognized internationally for his expertise in organizational behavior, leadership, and corporate social responsibility. Originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Professor Spicer began his academic journey at the University of Otago and completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne. Before joining City St. George, he served as professor of organizational studies at the University of Warwick. He has held visiting professorship at leading institutions, including London Business School, Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, McGill University, Lund University, the University of London, and the University of Sydney. A highly regarded educator, Professor Spicer has taught students ranging from first-year undergraduates to senior executives and co-developed an award-winning course on critical thinking for business students. His influential research examines well-being, organization politics, culture, identity, new organization forms, workspace, and leadership. He has studied a diverse array of organizations, such as financial institutions, government departments, seaports, libraries, media organizations, knowledge-intensive firms, universities, and social movements. As André published extensively in leading journals of our field, including Academy of Management Review, Organization Science, Academy of Management Annals, Journal of Management Studies, Organization Studies, Harvard Business Reviews, and the books published by written by André is together with Matt's Stupidity Paradox, Metaphors We Led By, The Wellness Syndrome, Business Bullshit, Desperately Seeking Self-Improvement. And he is a frequent commentator in Financial Times, CNN, BBC, and other popular media outlets. He is a sought-after speaker. He is given speeches in House of Lords, European Commission, Mansion House, and TEDx. And André is part of the senior leadership team of St. George's University of London and serves on the University Council. He previously had the role of head of Faculty of Management at Bias Business School. André, welcome, and thank you again for being with us. And Mats, everyone knows Mats Alvesson, but quick, very short introduction. Mats Alvesson's current research examines leadership, functional stupidity in organizations, and the everyday experience of bureaucracy and managerial work in universities. His research interests include critical theory, gender and power, the management of professional service and knowledge-intensive organizations, leadership, identity, organization image, organization culture, symbolism, qualitative methods, and philosophy of science. In addition to all the articles he published in leading journals, he has authored or co-authored several books, some of which are Return to Meaning, Reflexive Leadership, The Stupidity Paradox, Managerial Lives, Triumph of Emptiness, Qualitative Research and Theory Development, Constructing Research Question, Interpreting Interviews, Metaphors We Led By, the Oxford Handbook of Critical Management Studies, Understanding Gender and Organization, Reflexive Methodology, Changing Organizational Cultures, Knowledge Work, and Knowledge-Intensive Firms are to name a few. Mats teaches qualitative methods, knowledge work, and organizational change at both PhD and master level at Lund University. And in seminars, as far as I remember, when Mats starts seminars, he wants his book to be circulated. So I will do these books circulated virtually. So this is the changing organizational culture. These are the ones in my library. Return to Meaning, Reflexive Methodology, what else? The Triumph of Emptiness, here, Metaphors We Led By, Managerial Lives.
Boş.
Yes. and stupidity paradox together with André Spicer. And stupidity paradox also appeared in Turkish in aptallık paradoksu. Yeah, you see it now. So it's also in Turkish. And this book, Knowledge Work and Knowledge Intensive Organizations, can you see it? Yeah, here is the one that I have. I have a fetish on signed copies. This one is signed by Mats, telling me that congratulations, Ozan, for graduation from graduation day ceremony, 10th June 2008. Mats Alvesson, teacher. So time flies. And the other one is this one, Making Sense of Management, also translated into Turkish by our dear colleagues Pınar Memişsağır and Şule Aydın Turan, with a forward from Mats and Hugh, quoting and referencing our friends from here like Beyza, Mehmet, Ozan, and Martin Parker as well. So thank you very much for all the work here. And you tell teacher, yesterday was a Teachers' Day. I also congratulate all the teachers, all the people who are involved in education to make a impact. Belated Happy Teachers' Day. And yeah, questions. There you go. It wasn't that short introduction, but this needs to be honored. Okay. And the first question is to Mats, and we will go back like 40 years back in time. When you think about the first, when you edited with your critical management studies, how would you describe the broader landscape of society and our field, management and organization studies?
Yeah, when we started this, some scattered interest in critical management studies, not so much, and a lot of qualitative work was conducted. But then we felt that management is a very large field, it's very socially significant, influence a lot of people's lives, etc. And of course, this calls for a thorough critical examination. And then we just thought that, okay, we need to try to gather the troops and organize this a bit and become a bit more visible, presenting an alternative then to mainstream thinking that tended either the functionalist or qualitative case studies, also some other work. But we felt that a bit more powerful formulation of a critical alternative. So we were inspired by the Frankfurt School and to some extent Foucault, and then we made a case then for an anti-technocratic understanding of management and organization. And we tried to make this relatively broad also, including marketing, accounting, operational research, but mainly it's about organization studies, which is perhaps the mother discipline of a lot of the other sub-disciplines in management studies. So, and then we coined the term critical management studies, just hoping that this would catch some attention. But the term, the abbreviation was seen as handy, CMS. It's very quick and economical to use the three words. So that has kind of taking off and used quite frequently by people who like to present themselves as being a bit outside the mainstream, but not too odd or peculiar.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Well, moving on from Mats to Andre, what initially drew you to CMS in your early scholarly years? Like, did this interest take shape in New Zealand, or while you are doing your PhD in Melbourne, or later at Warwick? How did you come across and what made you a CMS scholar?
So it's interesting that when I started out studying, I went to university originally to do kind of business degree a little bit, but also an arts degree. So I sort of thought, I could do some things in anthropology and psychology and a range of other areas. And what I found at my university was that some of the most interesting sort of theoretical and philosophical work was actually being done in the management school, weirdly enough. So we had quite a good philosophy department, but they were all sort of analytical philosophers. So there's a famous guy there called Alan Musgrave who'd worked with one of the sort of epistemologists. So they were doing kind of fairly boring stuff. But within the management school, you had a group of people who are more interested in sort of post-structural theory. And I found that very fascinating. So they'd have reading groups frequently, sort of after work on Fridays. They'd often invite young students along. So I was a sort of a final year undergraduate student at the time, and then a master's student, and we'd get invited along to these reading groups with a few more senior scholars. And I found it very, very interesting. And it was sort of an opportunity to sort of widen my horizons. So I guess that was the sort of thing which made me hooked. And during that time, this is something I've never told anyone, actually. So I'll share it amongst this very small group of friends we have here online. Is I remember during my kind of final year, I guess, when I was studying for my master's degree, I was sort of got interested in consumption. And I remember sort of Mats's work kind of was at the forefront of that sort of, organization and consumption image orientation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading quite a lot of it and thinking, wow, this is really very interesting. And it was sort of a kind of gateway drug in some ways into kind of critical management studies. So I remember that was some of my earliest kind of engagements with critical management studies, to the extent that I was reading a lot. And I remember actually even having a dream at some point, and this is the point that I've never told anyone, that I saw some big road sign, and it said Alvesson on it in this dream. And little did I know that many, many years later, I'd sort of end up working with Mats quite closely. So I only thought about that some years ago. Anyway, so I went to Melbourne after that and did a more kind of empirical piece of work using discourse analysis, and also got very much into kind of studying resistance with my colleague who was a PhD student at the time, Peter Fleming. And after that, I was very fortunate to get a job in the UK at Warwick, which was one of the centres for critical management studies research at the time, which I found very interesting and sort of broadened my horizons. And in the later years, while I was at Warwick, I sort of took a visit to Lund, and at that point then got more involved in the Lund group and the sort of critical management studies program, which they ran there every summer or springtime for PhD students. And from that period, Mats and I and some other people in the Lund group began working on things. So for the first piece, I think, from my first visit to Lund was the piece which was about which we published in Human Relations about critical performativity. And then, stupidity paradox came along, and then we've done other work after that. So it's been a really interesting journey, let's say.
Yes. Thank you very much for sharing this journey and then the anecdote. Thanks a lot. And to question to both of you, I would like to discuss your the articles appeared in Journal of Management Studies. These articles attracted considerable attention. So based on these articles, how would you characterize the current state of CMS scholarship? The stock and the things to be done?
Well, I think that research in general, almost across any field, tend to reach the state where it's not so much energy, not so many really good ideas. People seems to be rather disciplined, much focused on journal publication. There's a lot of constraints, ethical clearance, intensification of competition of business schools, and people are very eager to get published. So the journal publication regimes has taken over, and that means that, and also with the massification of submissions, etc., tend to become more and more mechanical and bureaucratic and subspecialized and formulaic. So that is a problem, I think, in social science in general, probably also across the various non-social science disciplines. There was one piece in, I think it was Nature, saying that there are rather few disruptive, really novel studies across almost all fields. And management studies is suffering from that. And I do think that also critical management studies is very much part of a general kind of decline in terms of intellectual thinking, or people doing really impressive empirical studies and then having something novel and interesting to say. And it is tricky because so much has been said already and there's so much competition. And the poor journal editors, they have to process a very large number of journal articles, at least the leading ones. And that it means that we are a bit stuck in studies that tend to be not that extremely innovative or bold or making a great difference. That is perhaps because I'm an old person, and then it was better in the past, of course. André is younger and energetic and more positive. He's even a dean, so in that sense, you need to be more positive in how you talk about the issues. But I feel that we could do much better, actually, but it's difficult to get through all these forces tending to make us a bit more disciplined and cautious and a bit instrumental and formulaic in what we are doing.
All right, thanks. And Andre, what's your
Yeah,
thought?
so maybe I'll give a slightly different answer. So I think that's the broad motivation. The more technical answer is to say we were driven by the sense that increasingly, how to put this, sort of about 5 to 10 years ago, we were sort of worrying that, not corporate social responsibility, CMS as a field was sort of going into decline, and effectively just sort of finding the same thing over and over again, talking about the same points, the same kind of empirical studies. So you'd read an article and you felt like you could have read it 5 or 10 years ago, maybe with a different sort of theoretical spin or kind of gloss on it, but there seemed to be very little progress in the field. And it's probably mirrored in many other fields, not just in management studies more generally. So we looked at, say, institutional theory, and they seem to find this sort of thing, but the other areas. So we thought, okay, let's test out whether this is empirically correct or not. So we decided to the last big review, which was done on critical management studies work, was done, I think it was 2008 or something like that, so just before the financial crisis. So we decided that what we would do is to do a review from then up until, I can't remember, 2020 or something like that. As a little lockdown project, I spent a lot of time, and Mats did as well, reading through all of these things and summarizing them and finding out. We identified, I think, 10 themes, which you can find in the paper. What we noticed is that very little had actually changed. There'd been a few new trends appearing. So if I look at the 10 themes we found were studies of academia, alternative organizations, control resistance, discourse for Codian studies, gender, identity, Marxism, post-colonialism, psychoanalysis. And only a few of those were fairly new themes. So for instance, there were more work on post-colonialism, a bit more work on psychoanalysis, and a lot of navel gazing in terms of studying our own kinds of organizations. But many of these things had been done for quite some time, and we'd been involved in doing studies on that. So then we kind of had this idea that maybe CMS is offering this kind of one-dimensional critique, where we kind of identified a set of sort of problems in one-dimensional critique, which is like a sort of an overwhelming negativism. And it tends to be kind of focused on what we call authoritarianism. So there's kind of close following of a particular author and believing what some particular author says is the absolute truth, which might not necessarily be so. The second one is obscurantism. So the more obscure the reference, the more ideal and attractive it is. The third one is formulaic radicalism, so sort of some sort of radical positioning, but it's relatively formulaic and not particularly interesting. The third next one was usual suspectism, so it's like a little moral story where the manager's always the bad guy and the worker's always the good person, etc., and sort of falling into often not seeing the complexities of organizational and social life. And then the final point is sort of empirical light touchism. So doing 20 interviews and then you're sort of done. So that was kind of the first part of the article. And then, of course, as these things go, it ended up being extremely long. And it was a very long article. And then it became a kind of second article, which we can talk about in a bit if you like.
Yes, that I'm now asking, what was your suggestions? In the second one, you prepared like a 3-step approach, like understanding, question, reparation. Can you elaborate it a little bit? André, Mats?
Yeah, I think that it's extremely important really to understand the world. So sometimes if you come from CMS, you have powerful theoretical ideas and perhaps backed up with philosophy, and then you also have the political course, and that is what provides some muscles for research, and that's fine. But sometimes it leads to relatively constrained understanding of what goes on. And of course, we all have problems perhaps with empiricism and naive understandings of what is reality like. But you can be very curious about understanding what goes on. And there's a tendency that sometimes people into critical management studies are not so careful when it comes to doing the interpretive work. And it's not necessarily a matter of being collecting large amounts of data. That's not the key element, but being curious, being really interested, trying to be open-minded, to trying to find something in empirical reality where you acknowledge the complexity, but also you can come up with something that is a bit different. So another angle on things or phenomena that you haven't really thought about before. So that's one element, and that's the empirical in-depth understanding of phenomena, where you should be curious rather than, as Andy was saying, you have the usual suspects, so you have the battery of concepts and you use them and say something that is perhaps more reproducing what you already know and illustrating that rather than seeing the empirical stuff as a possible trigger for thinking differently. But then, of course, you need to, and that's the difference with critical management studies, that you are very eager then to go for support of resistance or emancipation or something like that. And that calls for some critical kind of reflection and distancing from pure empiricism or using conventional vocabulary to unpack what goes on. And then sometimes the problem is that it stops there. So people feel a bit so what, and then the challenge is then to try to come up with some ideas for alternatives. How do we think about it in different ways? Concepts that are performative, that open up and trigger some kind of response rather than rather abstract formulations of critique, and yet another critique of patriarchy or capitalism or bureaucracy or whatever. So there are the three elements, and of course this is a bit more demanding. But if we should do research, we probably should do things that are a bit more demanding, and then hopefully there's a payoff and some kind of reward, or at least intellectual satisfaction about doing this.
And then maybe just to add a little bit. So when we were doing this work, the kind of the suggestion which we gave is we were inspired a little bit by Marcuse's idea of one-dimensional man, right? So he talks about the one-dimensional man of the 1950s being this individual is a total consumerist, doesn't think critically about anything, and is very unreflexive. And we thought, well, we've got an interesting kind of almost different kind of one-dimensional person here, which is their one-dimensionality is almost a kind of focus on how would you put it? On critique always. They're always finding their whole drive is to find problems constantly and always sort of find these usual suspects that the problems lie into, and that's their one-dimensionality. They don't do these other two things, which a kind of critic is supposed to do. One being just first of all setting out to understand a phenomenon and just listening and seeing and observing, because often you'll be surprised with what reality really brings you. And then the second dimension is the critique. So that's kind of critical active, critic type person. And then the third dimension, as Matt mentioned, is this more imaginative identifying and thinking about alternatives. So in many ways, this article, the second article, is really a kind of an articulation of that. And a second kind of point of inspiration we found was this Eva Kossoff-Sedgwick, who sort of was a very well-known literary critic in the US at Duke University, and sort of helped put together the Duke University Literature Department, which is very famous. And just before she died, one of her last pieces was about the idea of reparative critique. And she was pointing out that often what you have is most critics are very paranoid and they see power everywhere and there's always domination and yada, yada, yada. And she says that that can actually lead people to find issues and problems where they either don't exist or they don't exist before they arrive there, right? And she says that we need to take a more reparative approach. And then she outlines what that would look like in this piece. And we sort of take a little bit of inspiration from that and sort of outline how one might go about doing that in management studies. And then the final thing to say is that that article on reparative critique had inspired quite a lot of work in literary studies, which is the so-called post-critical theory in literary studies. And we're sort of trying to build on that idea a little bit in CMS and sort of charting out the future. Maybe that's a way forward, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answers from both of you. And maybe two of you mentioned a little bit about the methodological landscape. Maybe we move on to methodological landscape. How do you evaluate the methodological landscape surrounding CMS today? Any thought on that?
Well, I think that people tend to follow the formula for when they or we are doing research. So it's a very strict regime. You should do data management. I mean, this is very much driven by leading journals, but these tend to be very attractive by from the point of view of a lot of people, and of course the entire career regimes with employment markets and the decisions who to hire, who to promote, and blah blah blah. It's very much driven by journal. Perhaps different in Turkey, and it's a bit soft also in Sweden. But in general, then people are very much into journal publication. So there's a weakening of scholarship and intellectuality because the form of a journal article makes a lot of people more into journal publishing technicians. And so much energy is into putting everything, every detail correctly. So literature review, vacuum clean the literature, and have method sections and so on. And this means that I think that what could be interesting with empirical research, particularly from a more critical point of view, that you are a bit more bold, a bit more imaginative, go in there and see what's happening. You see the absurdities. You can point at them in a more imaginative ways than is conventional. It tends to be a bit, not so much of that. The studies tend to be watered down. So you present data, and then hopefully the data they're seen as credible enough after you've done the interviews, etc., so that you can point at the pattern. With some luck, this indicates that people are suffering. There's domination. You can apply Foucault or the other studies or whatever, and then there is a storyline that is not that extremely different. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but sometimes they appear more in books than in management journals. So, but there are a lot of interesting things that could actually come out of empirical studies, but of course perhaps for some other methodological ideas, focusing a bit more on finding gold nuggets in empirical phenomena than covering broader patterns. Using frameworks and metaphorizations that are a bit different, perhaps working with thick description, really trying to uncover layers of meaning. So there are a lot of methodological ideas that are around, and they are sometimes, I think, liked by critical management studies, but we don't see so many really successful applications of all this. So I think that we are suffering from the same problems than as social scientists and management scholars in general.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can add
yes, André, please.
A couple of things to this. So point one, just to amplify a point Matt's made, is what we've seen is increasingly sort of management studies, particularly qualitative management studies, being sort of driven by a set of what would you call it, almost template. So like the GR method, everyone has to use this GR method in order to sort of articulate your findings. So we become increasingly sort of templatized, and that leads to very narrow or kind of particular kinds of findings. A side point to this is that there's actually quite a lot of work in the there's a whole field called the science of science, which is actually really interesting, kind of mainly quantitative studies of science. And one big finding there is, this is across all scientific disciplines, is that oftentimes you only get major advances in scientific fields through advances in methodology, right? Advances in theory kind of often come afterwards, but advances in methodology are one way to push things forward. And it's interesting that we haven't had any profound advances in methodology within our. That's sort of point one. Point two, so I think that that's an invitation to people on the call to start thinking about advances in methodological ways of doing stuff. Point two is, this is probably where Mats and I differ a little bit, is that over the years I've become kind of had my tastes of reading are sort of broadened a lot, and I read a lot of different stuff these days. Often far beyond critical management studies and organization studies, like even reading economist stuff and stuff. But I think the insight from that I've taken away is that CMS is quite fixated on using maybe one or two sets of methods, which is the qualitative methods, sometimes historical methods, and that's pretty much it. Whereas if you look at sciences more generally, there's a wide range of other methods we're not using: experimental methods, large-scale quantitative research, network analysis. There's many, many other, and particularly harnessing the power of large language models. So I think another way forward maybe for CMS researchers is to use a wider range of methodological stuff and not be kind of, what would you call it, kind of qualitative dogmatists. And I think that there's really power potentially, and we can add a lot, given we have, you know, I'm terrible at doing quantitative work. Can't do it really because I don't have the skill set, but I can work alongside of people who do have that skill set to probably do some interesting work. So often really strong quantitative work, having a qualitative dimension to it can be super interesting, I think. So that's one thing we can do as CMS researchers. Third observation, and this is very much from the perspective of a dean, I sort of think about sort of the future of, you know, business schools and all that sort of stuff, and think about, you know, why are we investing in research? How are we investing in teaching? All these kind of things. And the big thing I think that we'll probably be moving to in 10 to 20 years, or just over time, is that the unit, the objective of let's produce lots of top class journal articles. Yes, that will continue, but it might become slightly less important over time. And knowledge outputs, I think, will become broader. So the range of knowledge outputs that business schools are doing, I think I can imagine becoming broader. Things like practitioner reports, books, you know, interventions in the field, because I think this kind of age of just focusing on journal articles, I could imagine if we put ourselves 10, 20 years in the future, that might seem relatively bizarre, because if we take ourselves back 10, 20, 30 years, a total yes, journal articles were important, but there was a wider range of other knowledge output. So I'd ask us to think about different ways in which we articulate our knowledge.
Thank you, André. And speaking of methodology, this book, can you see it? Reflexive methodology. While we are talking about Mats were mentioning the cover of this book is your favorite. Is it still your favorite? And why?
It's probably the most influential academic book that I published. It is, but it's a kind of it's a broad method book and with a catchy title, Reflexive Methodology. So I think that. But it's referred to quite a lot, and I do think that it makes a good case then for qualitative research that is quite different then from here you go out there and you collect a lot of data and then you do data management, you process this with codification and other peculiar, I would say, techniques. So working reflexively, a bit more complicated and vague, but you can see this as an alternative way of thinking about method compared to all the other kind of stuff. So I think that in that sense, it's a rather powerful corrective or alternative reference point. So in that sense, I think that I'm quite happy about the book. It's appeared in a later edition after you bought that, Ozan. Yes. Probably forced when you were doing your master in Lund. And
yes.
So So
I'm happy to have it.
yeah, no, I think it's good.
Yeah, good.
But anyway, so I think that and I will continue to work with a lot of reflexivity stuff on how to produce research questions, how to do interviews in a more reflexive,
Yeah.
not data collecting ways, etc. So I think that's if one should work with method, I think that versions of reflexivity and a more creative, imaginative approach to empirical material, that's a bit different than the studies. We are very eager to get everything correct and be very kind of credible through doing all the measures and demonstrating that you followed all the techniques and so on. I think that's notoriously much more unreliable than what appears to be the case. And then how do you think about and you use empirical material for generating ideas and alternative understandings and so on. I think that is something at least I find very interesting and important to work with.
Yeah, thank you very much. And moving on to the education or the PhD education side of the CMS, I know, I mean, if you are not doing it, please do it. I strongly recommend you to follow Andres' social media accounts. I think he's quite frequently sharing his thoughts on the X and LinkedIn mostly. I don't know other outlets, but in one of your tweets in X shares, you mentioned while we were on AOM 2025 in Copenhagen, you talk about that you met with your former PhD student, and you were very glad to see them, how they nurtured and become scholars themselves. And how do you see the education side in terms of CMS notion of PhD education?
It's a good question. Well, I mean, the first thing to say, it is very satisfying when you see people going on and building a career after you and finding new things and sort of finding their own way. My own PhD students, I think many of them have sort of found their own way of being a scholar, I think, is the point I was trying to make, is that, you know, some of them have been successful with journal publications, but others have done other things. So one of them I remember meeting, and he sort of works half time. He's a good educator. He publishes a journal article every now and then. He takes care of his family the other half of the time, and you know, and he's made a life for himself, and it was satisfying to see that. And then another one, he's actually the first of my PhD students, has become a professor. She's been very good at doing kind of policy engagement and policy work. So last week she was at 10 Downing Street at the Prime Minister's residence here, working with them on, I can't remember which policy area, but she's focused on that. There's others who have gone on to be sort of more research oriented. Another one went back to China, and I think he's sort of more sort of styled himself as in focusing on education where he's from. So he works at Zhejiang in China, which is one of the top universities in China. So I guess that the big insight there is that we tend to think that there's only one way of being an academic, but in reality, and I see this as a dean, that there are multiple ways, there's multiple paths, and people create different paths for themselves in academic. And one trend which I sort of see is that in some ways there's been a bit of a narrowing, and in some ways we say, okay, you have to publish in these top journals, but I see things kind of broadening out a little bit at the moment in terms of educational paths. So in the UK, over the last 10 years, you've had a sort of two paths of the sort of research path, research and education path, and then the educationalist path for people who are good at doing education. But now we're increasingly seeing a sort of third path appearing, which is kind of a practice orientation, which is basically people who are more writing and influencing and practitioner sort of work, and they'll bring practitioners into the university, and they're creating a different kind of value, I think. So I guess the point I'm trying to say, and then also leadership roles are important. So the point is that an academic career can be long, and then there are often different paths in which you can take in it. There's not just one. When we tend to think, oh, we see some famous scholar and we look at what they're doing, and that's one way, but there are often multiple other ways, I think, is sort of one reflection there.
Thank you, Andre. Would you like to add something on the PhD level education, Matt, or?
No.
Okay, cool. And as you know, we are hosted by.
Oh, sorry, can I just add another thing?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is just a reflection at the moment. We're just thinking about our own PhD course at Bayes. And one thing we've seen is the sort of PhD creep. So the PhD process gets longer and longer and longer. It's 4 years, 3 years, now 4 years, now 5 years. People want to see 6 years. So it kind of delays launching into life. And then the bar seems to go higher and higher and higher constantly for PhD students around research. And one question we've been sort of asking ourselves is, okay, so the PhD is supposed to be partially a preparation for life in academia. The reality is that most PhD programs, a percentage of people will actually not go into academia. They'll go into doing other things. And we should recognize that and be proud of that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that even those who do go into academia, only a percentage of their time will actually be spent doing research. Being a kind of academic, you're going to be an educator, but you also may increasingly have to sort of engage with practice and influence practice. So the question is, what does that education look like if you're really preparing people for those roles? It's sort of a question we're asking ourselves, because currently it's all about preparation for doing research, right? And very particular kind of research, which is super narrow. And maybe we need to be a bit broader about how we think about PhD education.
Thank you for the comment. And the next question is about, like, we are hosted by the OMT interest group at the Turkish Academy of Management. So they love neo-institutional theory, but you criticize neo-institutional theory as experiencing a midlife crisis. Are you still having that idea about it, or is it now the midlife crisis is over, or moving on to the next crisis? Or what is the situation?
Well, I do think that, I mean, when you indicate a crisis, it's very much in the eye of the beholder. So I guess that our take is that they should feel that this is a crisis. I don't think necessarily that they would agree about this. But the problem is with institutional theory, that the institution, I mean, it's been around and it's a dominating approach, and a very large number of people in one way or another, they should refer to institutional feeds, and then how it's related to whatever you like to relate these broader institutions to: discourse, leadership, gender, you name it, and power. So it's kind of, as the Germans say, imagine für alles, somebody that can be used for all kind of purposes. It means that it becomes rather influential. And the problem is that when you have this concept that seems to be so useful, then it tends to stick. And a lot of people, they like to use the concept. And when you try to shake it up a bit, then it's very difficult to make people change, because you have your career investments, you love the concept, you have used it so many times, so therefore it must be good. It must be reproduced. We had a suggestion once where you should say that now, okay, institution theory, many interesting contributions, etc., but you should not overdo the use of the term. So perhaps if we would say that now we ban it for 5 years, so people can do whatever research they want, but they should not use the term institution, because it tends to be all over the place and it means absolutely everything and nothing. And people could agree with some of the critique, but we got some very angry comments about it. You can't be serious. You can't be serious. Institutions, they are there. They are so important. All research shows that. So you can't then suggest that one should stop then referring to institutions. Well, we think that you can refer to the empirical phenomena, but not necessarily label everything institution. And in that sense, I think that, well, the institutional theories, they will survive, and a lot. When we wrote that article, a number of people that came up to me at conferences, I like to shake your hands. Thank you very much for writing that article. So I think that a lot of people appreciated this critique with some irony. But then if you're into the field, and unless you have so many bodies, as institutionalized theories is so strongly institutionalized, it's very difficult then to rock the boat. So people tend then to continue to use it, and they get all the publications, or last number of publications through. So it's a bit difficult to change things, I would say. But I do think that it's very important for everybody in academia, when is enough enough? So after a large number of years using the same key author, we talked about authoritarianism or favorite concepts, or referring to the Joya method for the time 2000. I think that now it's enough. Now I think it's good if we can do some kind of restarting, not forgetting or totally neglecting early work, but not just reproducing it, but really see, okay, can we do something a bit different?
Two observations.
André?
Yeah. So two observations. One, actually three. Number one, I think, just to amplify the point Mats is making, is I was teaching some students today. I was talking about this one basic rule of social life, which is the kind of curvilinear relationship of almost everything, right? So a little bit is good. Medium amount is generally pretty good, but too much, I have this idea that if we just keep on adding, it's going to get better, but actually it goes downwards, right? So knowing when enough is a good point, and that's probably true with an epistemological aspect as well. Point two, and this is a research question, is have we actually beginning to see a sort of a decline of interest in institutional theory? It would be interesting to know whether after we published that in 2018 or whatever, whether there's been slightly fewer pieces using institutional theory in recent years, so that's the second question. The third question, which I find totally bizarre, when you sort of engage in policy debates and stuff like that, institutional theorists have touched on things like how do you create a new market, and how do you make a practice normalized, and I've done hundreds of studies on these things. But how frequently are all these ideas from institutional theory actually used to sort of guide either policy or actual changes in people's lives? And the answer is probably quite rare, actually. Other fields which have studied this sort of meta-organizational level have policy recommendations and have tools, but institutional theory, maybe, I don't know how much. So it's an interesting question.
Thank you very much for the answers. Now it's the Jimmy Fallon, the Tonight Show moment. So today we are going to celebrate the publication of The Art of Less, how to focus on what really matters at work. Mats and Andres' new book. Can you see it a little bit? Yeah, I think.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, the Art of Less. So the Art of Less is already published, and we are going to congratulate your publication. And then you talk about the sludge, organizing sludge. So I think this book will have will get great attention and maybe translated into Turkish soon. So what is your take on this book? And first, congratulations. And yeah, I don't have the book. I have the cover of the book, but what is your opinion?
I
Yeah,
have the
you
book
have the
here,
book. You have written it, so you have the
I've
book.
written it. So I have one copy at least. So
Good. I want one signed version then.
I will get you a version or so.
Thank you.
So no, I think that this is a rather good project in many ways. I think that illustrates then some aspects or dimensions of critical management studies that not been explored so much. So the tendency that we just build our own prisons together with others, so the external forces, legislation, but also then a lot of people that are doing presumably good things, working with well-being and gender equality and diversity and safety and rights and democracy and so on. So sometimes you have all these good intentions and a lot of structures, practices, expertise, wanting to do good things. Of course, together with all the perhaps less obviously good things that people are supposed to do, strategies, and have enormous amount of bureaucracy and rules and systems and regulations, etc., that it tends to create organizations that are a bit dysfunctional, because meaningful work, autonomy, focusing on what seems to be relevant and creating value, that tend to be a bit lost because of organizations overdoing a lot of things. And part of this is for good intentions, and you can see that from a critical or progressive point, it makes some sense. But if it's too much of this, and if you're not very careful, then you have this tendency that organizations, they become overburdened and with well-intended structures, expertise, training sessions, you have meetings, etc., etc. And then we all fall victims to the overburdening of organizations, and we call that sludge, organizational sludge. So the flow, the workflow, it's being prevented then by, you need to fill in these forms, you need to have this training, you need to do that and that and that, and we need to be cautious, and we need to guarantee absolutely everything. And that tends to create a lot of frustrations and problems and inefficiencies, etc. So we thought that if one can target organizations in terms of overdoing a lot of things, and then see how that tends to reduce freedom for people at the same time as they or we are being taken care of. So it's a progressive element in all this as well. But the trade-off between safety, precaution, and then autonomy and ability then to take more responsibility and exercise freedom, then that is rather tricky. So we try to point at that and also have some ideas for how to de-sludge organizations to reduce then the amount of things that tend to overburden organizations and a lot of people's lives, but less relevant and less significant, less meaningful things.
André, congratulations to you as well. So
Yeah.
we are also waiting for the art of less. What are your thoughts about
Yeah. So if I'll expand on a few things. So one, just an example, actually, this is a current example. I don't write about my workplace at all in the book. It's not there at all. It's other people's workplaces. But let's just say some of my experiences working in a university have shaped some of the ideas there. But I'll just give the listeners to this one example of the kind of sort of process that happens around how sludge is created in university. So in the UK, during the summer, the government passed a law which is about free speech in universities. So universities need to be places where free speech is allowed. Okay, it sounds very good. We'd all support that probably. Then it gets implemented, and then all of the universities then run away and have to come up with a policy about free speech. So our new university lawyer, we just appointed a university lawyer who goes away and drafts this policy, and it all looks very reasonable. And then it has to go through 3 or 4 different committees, and then there's consultation around that. And then it comes as once this reasonable policy is passed, then it turns out to every single event which we run at the university, if it's not directly tied to a teaching, you have to fill in a 4-page form. So if I'm inviting you to give a speech to 10 students about, let's say you're an actuarial scientist. So I have actuarial scientists who do extremely complicated technical things. If you're going to come and give your speech, I have to fill out a 3-page form to guarantee that we're protecting freedom of speech. So this results in my school, we'll probably have to fill in about 1,000 of these 3-page forms every single year. It includes people coming and giving career talks and all sorts of stuff. in order to protect freedom of speech. And then you explain it to people and they say, no, you must fill in these forms, da 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 da. So what you've got here is a good objective. So many people would say we need to protect freedom of speech. And then this incredible bureaucratic burden. And as a result, it actually limits the amount of time and actual space people have to do, to express themselves. And there are many, many other examples of this in any organization where you have a good objective and then you create a policy and procedure and process and rules and da-da-da-da, and then people have to begin going through these things, and it creates a sort of a side process, and that becomes another burden on people, and it narrows. And when you add all of these things up, even though they might be good individually, they become a kind of a incredible burden on people, and they narrow the space people have to actually do their core job, right? So a recent study of doctors in the UK found that junior doctors, who are the people who are supposed to do most of the work, spend about 80% of their time doing non-patient facing tasks, filling in forms, interacting with computer systems, all of that sort of stuff. So as a result of all these non-patient facing tasks, they have less and less time to actually deliver healthcare and more time where they're spent caring for technological systems in certain ways. So in some ways, that's what we want to get at in this art of less, is this point that most of the time in organizations, our good intentions are sort of weighing down people from actually doing their jobs. And that's incredibly frustrating for professionals who just want to do their jobs. And it's also a big problem for organizations and society as a whole, because it becomes incredibly costly to run these things where you're putting 80% of your effort into producing the non-valuable good that the organization is trying to create. So that's the basic message of the thing, and then we can talk about how you get out of that if you want.
Yeah, thank you very much. I saw many of my colleagues nodding, so yeah, I think we are also experiencing this type of atmospheres at work or in social life or anywhere. So yeah, I think this is going to be a good help book for us all to sludge the organization, get rid of organization sludge and disludge our lives and so on. So thank you very much and congratulations again for the book. And this is going to be the third book that the André Spicer's Wellness Syndrome also translated into Turkish. So it's already there. So many books are around. And I think the Art of Less will also get great attention. And do you want to add something before we move on to Q&A, André and Mats?
Well, yeah, I have a comment. I think that it's so frustrating with all this kind of stuff, and partly it's a matter of prisons built by well-intended people somewhere else that leads us to be in prison then, but we also tend to build our own prisons. So and you have this padded cell syndrome. Well, PhD students, they can do harm, maybe unethical issues, so therefore we build this padded cell type of arrangements around our lives in order to protect ourselves from doing stupid things or getting harm. It leads to immaturization and a lot of problems. Also, that we are not so capable of doing really good research, because all this tend to domesticate us, to make us not like free thinkers or bold scholars, as much as very cautious. And here we have permission to do this. We need to adapt to this. We are controlled in so many different ways. By ourselves, our own worries, by our institutions, by journals. And a lot of this is just too much of stuff that we could reduce quite radically. And a lot of all this comes from ourselves if we are not very careful. And I do think that all this is like a gold mine for interesting research. So what's happening here? Partly what hits us, but also how we are relating to all this. Do we protest? Do we take initiative? Do we do self-imprisonment as a response on all this without really being so aware of all this. So it's self-evident you do so and so on because these are the regulations and expectations, etc. And then we build our own prisons, at least to some extent. And I think that from there then up to how management and institutions, sorry for using that term, but still how they are different ways then constraining us. I think that is very interesting from critical management studies people to really study. And if you're interested in doing something ambitious, I'm very happy if you contact me, because this is one of the intended research programs that I'm working with, I hope, in the near future.
So maybe I'll add two points. One is around one of the last chapters in the book is entitled Institutional Minimalism, and the basic idea, in some ways, it's a sort of a big sort of societal point, is that many of our kind of institutions, and I'm talking about proper institutions here, I'm not talking about tying shoelaces practices and stuff. I'm talking about prisons, military, universities, those kind of real institutions. The problem with many of those institutions is they've become overburdened with trying to achieve too many things. So our hospitals become places which are not just healing the sick, but are trying to, create more equality in society and make people more creative and be more efficient. And there's a long list of things they're trying to achieve. And the same thing with universities. It's not just research, teaching, and maybe trying to change a bit of society or impact. It's also, trying to facilitate local economic development and a long list of things. And as a result, the resources which are devoted to the key objective of institutions become squeezed as you try and achieve too many other things. So one of the normative points in the book is just to say, let's try and focus on the basic function that our institutions, each of them, are supposed to do. And then maybe they might become a little bit less costly and a little bit more, provide a bit more satisfying services. I think that's one point. And I forget what the other point is, so I'll stop here.
That's okay. I think we have created enough curiosity for the book, and we should leave it here. The Art of Less is going to be with us. So yeah, and question and answers. I'm sure that there are like burning questions I would like to add. We have like 15 to 20 minutes if you have. Any question now is mic is yours. So any question that you would like to ask André and Mats? So that says, so how we should evaluate this silence, Mats?
Well, it's probably reflexive science. People try to come up with something very intelligent to say, or just into a contemplation mood.
Yeah. I mean, I think many of us are like,
but it could be
digesting.
framed in the that part. I was I was teaching some students today, and I was talking about Parkinson's laws, that work